Starting on at the very bottom of page 43 in your notebook. The very bottom of page 43 with the discrepancies. But before I do that, it was brought to my attention last week after class that I needed to clarify something. And if you recall, we talked about that the Gospels are always attacked as a source. Hi, Linda. Good to see you. Is always attacked as a source, that the source is not credible, that the Gospels aren't credible. And one of the things that they say is that the Gospels were not written by the authors that are ascribed to those writings, like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that those really weren't the real authors, and so they're not eyewitness accounts. And so we had said that there was a church leader named Papias of Hierapolis, and his life overlapped that of the apostles. He knew John, the apostle John personally. He knew the daughters of Philip, and it was a late 1st century, early 2nd century church leader. We said that he verifies in writing that, something changed.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. That Matthew's account is his own story, that Mark's account is the account of Peter, Luke's account is the account of Paul, and that John gives his own account. But that's not the complete story. It's not that exclusively. And I wanted to touch on this again because this person that brought this up made a very valid point. So we're looking at this from the standpoint the critics are saying that the Gospels are not written by the people that it's ascribed to. But if we look at it from a source standpoint, even though we say that Mark is Peter's account and Luke is Paul's account, we know that there were other sources. You remember this diagram earlier. We said that most all biblical scholars believe that both Matthew and Luke borrowed information from Mark. And we looked at a couple of passages, if you remember, where it was nearly word for word from Mark into Matthew or Mark into Luke. And that we know that, based on that Luke and Matthew borrowed some elements from Mark for so they used Mark as, in fact, Luke and Matthew used Mark as a source. There's also this hypothetical Q source, and that's a source that they believe had a lot of the quotations of Jesus, sayings of Jesus, and it's hypothetical. It's never been found, but there's enough commonalities and there's enough thread that can be drawn between all the Gospels that lead them to believe there was a source that was called Q. We also said that, especially in Luke's case, Luke says, and this is in Luke chapter 1, verse 2 and 3 at his introduction, and he says, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses, ministers of the word, delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having had perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write to you an orderly account, most excellent Theophilus. Luke had other sources as well. Luke was a brilliant historian. He was very thorough. We get that sense from his writing in Acts. All the geography and the historical events, the geopolitical events, all of those line up perfectly with history from what Luke said in his account. So if we take Luke, for example, Luke had all these other particular sources. He borrowed some from Mark, we know that. But he also has a lot of his information came from Peter. And so that's when we say Peter was the source for Mark. We don't mean exclusively. That there were different sources. And Luke says I used different sources. He interviewed different people. And so the same thing with Mark as well. He used Peter, but he also used other sources. So I wanted to make sure I clarified that. Last week we stopped off at this point. So we were talking about these objections that critics have. And if you remember, we're looking at the Christian resurrection narrative. And rather than talk about the resurrection that we all know, what we're doing is a polemic. We're arguing against the arguments that the critics put forward that say the Christian resurrection story is not true. And so we're arguing against those critics. And one of their arguments was deficient sources. And so we've started looking at those deficient sources. Under deficient sources, they say there's a document gap, there's a time gap, and we looked at that, the time gap between the resurrection of Jesus and when the first Gospels were written, that 60 to 65 year span, and they argue about that time gap, and we said there was nothing written in that early period because they were anticipating Jesus' return and the Diocletian destruction early in the 4th century destroyed who knows how many Christian documents that could have been lined up in that period that we think there's no writings there. And then they complained that the Gospels are propaganda, and we said that that's just kind of a baseless assumption that they've thrown out. There's not much weight behind that. And then we got to discrepancies between the different accounts, and that's where we want to pick up this morning. Again, it's at the bottom of page 43 in your notebooks where we'll start. So we've all talked about this before. We had said early in this class series, this synoptic problem. Why are the Gospels different, which is the way we usually pose it? Why is there a difference between the way Matthew writes it and Mark writes it? And we've always just said, well, it's two different viewpoints writing about the same thing, and there's a lot of truth to that. But in actuality, the synoptic problem is, why are the Gospels so similar? If two of us went and saw an event and then we sat down and wrote about it independently, there would probably be more differences in what we saw than similarities. And the fact that the Gospels are so similar, why are they so similar? And that comes in some parts. That's where the idea that Matthew and Luke take information from Mark helps solve some of that problem. But anyway, these discrepancies, and we're all aware of them. And we'll look at the first one is Jesus' confession. And this occurs in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. If you recall, Jesus was arrested in the garden. He was taken before the Sanhedrin first, before the Jewish informal. It wasn't before the actual meeting of the Sanhedrin, because that was illegal for them to meet at night. The first place they took Jesus was to the house of Annas. And so at Annas' house, they start to ask questions, and there's all these questions come about. He ends up going from Annas' house to Caiaphas' house, then from Caiaphas' house to the Sanhedrin. Well, during the middle of all these interrogations, they ask him who he is, and how they ask, and what they ask is different in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The general idea is the same, but the wording is different, and so they the critics complain about, why are these different? And that has a very understanding and a very simple answer, and it's audience, right? Audience matters. And so if you bring Jesus before the Sanhedrin or Caiaphas or Annas, any one of those, if you bring him before those and you're writing about this story to Jews, you need to write it so that it impacts Jewish thought. If you're writing it to Gentiles really could care less about all the Jewishness of what happened. So what we read in Matthew was written for Jews. What we read in Matthew is a lot of emphasis on the question, are you the coming Son of God from Daniel 7? Are you that God? Are you that Jesus? Are you the Messiah as we Jews understand it? That's the important question that they're asking. That's the way Matthew writes it out there, because the Jews that are reading Matthew's document, that are reading his gospel, they want to know, did he say that he was the Son of God from Daniel 7? Well, if you're, Luke writing to Gentiles, that stuff doesn't mean anything to Gentiles. Daniel 7, okay. So what does that mean? So that part's not a big part of the explanation in Luke's accounting of it. But they see these differences and how this is. I'd encourage you to read those. They're fascinating, the differences in them. But anybody have a harmonized gospel? I know you do. But anybody know what a harmonized gospel is? So I'd encourage you to do this. It's very interesting reading. So there's harmonized Gospels out there, and you can get them in different translations, but it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all together, paragraph by paragraph by paragraph, through the whole New Testament. Or through the Gospels, just through the Gospels. And it's so fascinating to say, this is what they said in Matthew, this is what they said in Mark, John doesn't even cover it. Luke says this, and so it's called a harmonized gospel. I'd encourage you to get one. It's great for your study, especially when you're studying about the Gospels. And things like this pop out at you. So Jesus is before the council or before the Jews, and the difference you can see, it's all right there on one page together. Anyway, audience matters is the point. And so it's very simple to explain why there's allegedly these discrepancies in the story. The second one is the story about Mary. And we've seen this before. We've talked about it in Bible class, or I'm sure you have at some point growing up, or even here in this church you've talked about it. It's pretty obvious. It's one of the ones that the critics like to go to. If you look at John's account of Mary going to the tomb, and that's in John chapter 20 verse 1, we see that Mary goes to the tomb by herself. But in the other account, she goes with other women or other people. So there's a discrepancy there. Why does John get it wrong and the others get it right? Or why does John get it right and the other three get it wrong? Did Mary go by herself or with other people? This is a big discrepancy. I can't trust the gospel because this is a big discrepancy. That's what the critics say. Well, to add to it, the next verse in John chapter 20 verse 2, he goes back and he refers to we in the plural. That Mary didn't go by herself, that there was we. So which is it? Now that's another layer of confusion. Was it just Mary by herself in John, or who is we? This is not a mixing of designations. And by the way, if you'll look on page 44 of your notes, about halfway down under the heading that says Mary, there's just the chapter and verse number 24:12. If you'd write Luke in front of that, it's just kind of standing out there on its own. That's Luke 24:12 and Luke 24:24. I made some errors. If you do that, that will fix that. So it's interesting which one is right, and I'm not going to answer it because there's another one that we'll talk about that's related to it, and that's the angels at the tomb. We've noticed this before too. Is it an angel? Is it two angels? Is it a man? The accounts line up like this. Matthew says it's one angel. Mark says it's a man. Luke says it's two angels. Look at all that discrepancy. We can't trust the Gospels because they don't know what they're talking about. And so this is one of the big issues that the critics put forward. But it's interesting in this case that angel and man are interchangeable. Those are interchangeable words, and we can see that in Genesis. If you want to flip to Genesis 19:16, just to take a look at it. Genesis 19:16, this is where Lot is hesitating. It's time to escape. It's time to get out of Sodom before everything just comes bearing down upon them, and the angel is there and trying to get them to leave, and Lot hesitates. And it says in there that the men grasp their hands and pull them out of the city. The men. But they're actually angels. So it's not uncommon for angels to be referred to as men. Men aren't very often referred to as angels, but angels are referred to as men quite a bit. The other thing, and this goes back to Mary, is they didn't write the way we write. They addressed a particular person, and if that person was in a whole crowd, I could be writing about something here, and if I'm writing about Chad, I'm writing as if there's no one else in the room, because y'all don't matter because I'm writing about Chad. Now in modern literature, we want to paint the picture so that you can get a mental picture of what's going on. We would say there were, in some various way, we would say there's 49 other people in here plus Chad. But in the ancient world, they didn't do that, so they just focused just on Chad. That's why it was just Mary that went to the tomb, because Mary was the subject of the sentence. And that was real common in the way that they wrote in that day. And so that is a very valid explanation for what happens there. But we also see other discrepancies in the angels themselves. Are they standing or sitting or kneeling or, whatever? It varies. It varies depending upon the account that you read. There again, critics say they can't get the story right. Either they were standing or sitting. Either they were kneeling or they weren't. Was it one or two? You see how it just gets blown bigger and bigger and bigger. The Greek language, I think, has 130,000 words. That means one word covers a whole lot of things. We've got, I believe, 3 million. Anybody know what the number is now? I think 3 million English words in the dictionary. The ancient Greek had 130,000, so one word meant a whole lot of different things. In Greek, the word for standing and sitting is the same word. They didn't care. However you want to take it. Standing, sitting, it doesn't matter to me. So those words are interchangeable. So if one says sitting and one says standing, it's the same thing. It's not two different things. So there's not a discrepancy there. The word means present or stationary. They're not running. They're not moving. They're present. They're there. That's what, not necessarily one position or the other. And that's what the Greek word means. I don't know if I've said this before or not, but I think there's 16 different ways to say Jesus loves John. I think we'll get to that. There's 16 different ways to say that in Greek. And it's just a completely different language. But, so it's a speaker-focused writing style. So it's whoever is speaking. If Chad was speaking to me and we were having this engagement like we were talking about, I'm only focused on him and not the rest of you. Even if we're all in a gang going to the baseball game or something. If I'm talking to Chad, we're the only two that are going to the baseball game. So it's very unique in that way. We talked about the angels standing and setting. And so deficient sources is an invalid criticism of the Christian resurrection story as well. And so we've worked our way through these criticisms, or several of them anyway. And if we start to look at the Christian resurrection narrative from the same standpoint and go through the same criteria that we did with the naturalistic theories, we'll go through and look at the explanatory scope and the explanatory power, plausibility, ad hoc, nature of it, and the illumination, and we'll go through all of those. But we're also looking at not how well it ranks, but how well does the Christian narrative compare with the other theories. How plausible, how much more plausible is it? Or is it the same amount of plausibility, but how much more plausible? All of the naturalistic ones were pretty much the same. They all had to rely upon what? Hallucinations. All the other naturalistic theories rely upon hallucinations. They're all pretty much the same as far as plausibility. Actually, down here, plausibility. And so the Christian story should be a lot higher up here. But we've looked at these claims about the Gospels being legend. They said that they violated Occam's razor, and that's the simplicity. The more complex a story it is, the less believable it is. And so it satisfies Occam's razor as well. And we've looked at the different criticisms, and we've satisfied those, to a considerable degree. We could go much deeper, but time doesn't permit. And so if we begin to look at this ranking, and we'll go through this, for the Christian resurrection narrative, the explanatory scope, it has a lot of explanatory scope because it does answer the three bedrock facts. It gives detail around those. It gives the reason. It agrees that Jesus was died by crucifixion. It agrees that the apostles after his death had experiences that they believed were the risen Jesus, and then also it agrees with Paul's story that the risen Jesus appeared to him. And so there's a lot of scope. It covers all the questions that one would ask as far as what happened to Jesus after he died. And the Christian resurrection story covers just about everything you can imagine. So that's got a very broad scope to it. And so we would say that it passes that criteria. But the next one gets tough, and that's the explanatory, that was explanatory power. The next one gets tough, and that's explanatory scope, and that gets us back to that thing that's kind of been at the back of our mind the whole time, is that the Christian story is different. And the reason it's different is because it relies upon a supernatural causal agent to raise Jesus from the dead. And so that becomes a bit of a difference, and more than a bit of a difference. And remember, we're still at the historical standpoint. We're still looking at this from history, from facts of history, and not from the inspiration of the Gospels or the inspired Bible account. We're looking at it purely from historical documents. We've referred to the Bible many times to this point. And if you recall, when I started, I said we weren't going to get to the Bible till we get way over here. So these references to the Bible all along have been references to the historical documents that are contained in the Bible, not the Bible as the inspired Word of God, but as historical documents. And we're still at that point. And so we look at explanatory power, and we continue to look at it from a historical standpoint, and we take the supernatural, and still we have this set to the side. Remember, we said historians can answer the question, did Jesus rise from the dead? Does the evidence suggest that Jesus rose from the dead? But historians are not within their domain or within their scope to say God supernaturally raised Jesus from the dead. Historians can't say that. So we're still at the historical standpoint, and the explanatory power from a historical standpoint, when we look at the resurrection account, the Christian resurrection account, it has a lot more explanatory power than the naturalistic theories because they rely on hallucinations. And hallucinations, as we saw, especially the group hallucinations, are a way far out there thing. So it doesn't have a lot of explanatory power. So here we look at these naturalistics trying to explain the resurrection by hallucination, and so they're down here, the Christian resurrection, explaining it that Jesus actually rose from the dead as the documents say he did. Then that has a lot more explanatory power than the others. Remember what our friend Bart Ehrman said. He said there's really only two options. Either Jesus was raised from the dead or they were seeing things. It's either one or the other. It can't be both. And we've looked over and again at hallucinations lacking in explanatory power. Hallucinations are rare. Multimodal hallucinations are even more rare. And it just is a poor explanation. And so as far as explanatory power goes, it engages with the historical facts, as we said. We talked about what Bart Ehrman said. And so the Christian story passes our criteria for explanatory power. The next category is plausibility. And we have this supernatural implication rises up again in plausibility. How plausible is it for a unseen supernatural being to raise a human being from the dead? And there again, if we look at historians, we can't look at it from that standpoint. Not as historians, and we're still in the historical realm. And so the supernatural implications are quite significant. You see, here's the story. If there is a supernatural being, the resurrection of Jesus is highly plausible. But if there is no supernatural being, then the resurrection of Jesus is almost impossible. And so if we're still at the historical standpoint and we look at it, the plausibility of the resurrection, if there is no God, is nearly zero. Dead men stay dead. But if there is a God, it's very highly likely that Jesus was raised from the dead. And so we have to continue on and try to keep our bias out of it. As I said, we're still working as historians here. We try to keep neutrality, and with that neutrality, we're neither excluding nor presupposing divine agency in the resurrection, so we're still holding that away. Just looking at the evidence, was Jesus raised from the dead or not? And that's where we're still at. But if you look at the historical, from a historical standpoint, if you look at the Christian resurrection story, it does pass for plausibility. Even if you're just looking at the historical facts. Look at the writings and the testimony, the eyewitnesses, the eyewitness writings, all of that leads us to believe it's plausible Jesus was raised from the dead. Not saying what caused his raising from the dead, but it's plausible, and so it's the passing score as well. And here again, our next categories we talk about, it needs to be less ad hoc. It needs to have less made up stuff to rank higher in the ranking, and so the supernatural comes into play again. Because if there's a supernatural being that exists, the resurrection is not a bunch of made up stuff. But if he doesn't, he is. This is why the resurrection is positioned where it's at in a cumulative case argument. All of these are taking the Michaels of the world. When we remember Michael, he doesn't believe in the authority of the Bible. He doesn't believe in Jesus. He doesn't believe in all this. And we're taking Michael through all of these steps to get us to the idea, to get him to the idea that a God does exist. And so if you have the unbeliever in their mind, okay, I've got it, God does exist, then you get to the resurrection. The resurrection is a whole lot more acceptable if you already have in your mind God exists. Now, an evidentialist approach, which is not what this is, the evidentialist apologists start with the resurrection. That's their very first thing. They say, let's begin with the resurrection, historically, and let's look at it. Well, you haven't even got them to God yet. And so if they don't believe in a God, and you start here, and then it's not very long before you say, Jesus raised from the dead, that implies a supernatural created being to raise him from the dead. And so it's too much too quick for people that are so opposed to those ideas. So if you move them along, they start saying, yeah, that does sound like there's a supernatural being, and the Hebrews said there was, and okay, and now he raised from the dead. Yeah, I can buy that because there's a supernatural being that's powerful enough to do that. And so that's why this is positioned where it's at. So here again, though, we're still in the historical mode. So as far as ad hoc goes, you can say that it takes a lot of faith to believe in evolution. The critics, if they don't believe in the resurrection, more than likely they believe in evolution. They believe in a lot of things that we don't believe. There's a brilliant book that came out several years ago by Norm Geisler and Frank Turek. And the title of it is amazing. The title is, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. And I just love that. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. It takes too much faith to be an atheist. I have to believe in evolution. I have to believe in either a world that's eternal, which can't be. You can't go back forever. There can't be an eternally past world. You have to believe in evolution. You have to believe in all these things just happening just so to be an atheist. They're idiots. Really. There's no logical way you can be an atheist and have any reason. So I distract myself. You have to have a lot of faith to not be a Christian. The resurrection is far less ad hoc. It has a lot less made up stuff. When you get deeper and deeper into the science of it, did I tell you about transported panspermia? I think you and I talked about that one time, Chad. This is how far out they get now. Some of the scientists to keep from indicating that there is a supernatural being that created everything. They say, where does life come from? And they said, well, we've tried all these things, and you Christian scientists keep coming along and go, well, no, we can't. You disputed that, and you showed us that's wrong, and you showed us that's wrong. And so now we're going to take it completely out of this galaxy. So there was a meteorite that some bacteria jumped on and hitched a ride and came all the way through and crashed on Earth and seeded the Earth with life. Now dispute that. So that's where science is at. They just keep kicking the ball further and further down the road. How much faith does that take to believe in that?
A lot.
You know, first of all, is there any bacteria that can withstand re-entry heat? You know, that's number one. Anyway.
Where the meteorite come from.
Yeah, exactly. So where did that come from? You know, the bacteria on the meteorite. But they get really, really deep. And all this stuff, like I said, we've just touched all these things. I've been 7 years studying this stuff, and trust me, they can go so incredibly deep and get so far-fetched and far out there. You don't have enough faith to be an atheist. It gets that crazy. So the resurrection narrative story passes as far as ad hoc because it is so much less ad hoc than the naturalist theories are. And so we talk about illumination, and that's the last one, and this one is kind of an odd category, and we had one in the class that said, you know, that's a weird category, and I agree with you, but this is the model that we've been using. And illumination simply says that if the Christian resurrection story is true, then it illuminates a lot of things for us in life. And well, certainly it does, so it passes. And so we end up with all passing scores, which is not surprising. We knew that, right? We knew that 3 months ago when we started over there. I'll put y'all through all of this. So this is what the model ends up telling us. This is the ranking this is the spectrum of historical certainty. And based upon this model, we can say that the historical evidence alone, we can be assured that the resurrection of Jesus is a very certain fact. And so I had a great privilege to visit with the author, Michael Licona, that came up with this model, and we've followed his stuff on the resurrection. Not on any of the other, but as far as the resurrection goes. And I had the great privilege to spend a day with him in L.A. And one of the questions that I asked him was, what would it take to get to certainly historical? Why can't the resurrection be certainly historical? And he said that was a good question, but he said, incontrovertible proof is both unattainable and an unreasonable expectation from a historical standpoint. He said the Christian resurrection narrative is by far the very best explanation for historical evidence and the historical facts that exist. It would be all but impossible to have both high enough quality and high enough quantity of evidence from a 2,000-year-old event to grant the event the highest possible ranking, which is certainly historical. He said that there are very, very, very few events in secular history that satisfy that certainly historical account. And so just from history we look at it that way. So in the end, and this is where we make the big transition. Y'all ready? Hang on. In the end, the fact of the resurrection is a historical matter. The fact of the resurrection is a historical matter. The meaning of the resurrection is a theological matter. And so we've taken history as far as we can go. Historically, we've said that it is very certain, it's a very certain fact that Jesus was raised from the dead. And that's as far as history can take us. And so now we're taking our history hat off and we're putting our theology hat back on and our reasoning hat back on, and we're away from the confines of history now, and we're looking at this from a bit different perspective. And when we do this, what do we see? When we do this, when we back up, what we see is that the resurrection bears irrefutable evidence that Jesus was who He says He was. Jesus had claimed Himself to be from God, a messenger of God. He claimed Himself to be God. and that he was going back to God. That's the theology that comes out of this certainty of the resurrection. But what does this do for Jesus himself? And I want you to think about that in your mind. What does this do for Jesus? N.T. Wright's another resurrection scholar. He's a British man that's done a lot of work around the resurrection. He says, the resurrection was the sign to the early Christians that the living God had acted at least in accordance with His ancient promises. Remember when we started here, we said that there was an ancient people group that said that God had spoke to them and had promised a Messiah. This living God had acted at least in accordance with the ancient promise and thereby showed himself to be God, the unique creator and sovereign of the world. And that's what we've been slowly discovering all along the way. There's a creator God who created everything. He's sovereign. On and on and on and on. And now He's raised His Son from the dead. And so from our Christian worldview, we can add quite a bit to our Christian worldview. And this is our next to last worldview. And we can say this. By virtue of being raised from the dead, it can be said that Jesus was born of flesh, walked among men on earth, was crucified by the Romans, died, was buried, and was raised from the dead by His supernatural Father, God. This reality evidences the divine nature of Jesus, including His divine authority regarding at least all temporal matters. Jesus said He was God, and God raised Him from the dead. Jesus must have been God. Since the resurrection evidences Jesus' divine nature, it's reasonable to assume that He possesses divine authority as well. If He's divine in nature, He has divine authority. And so that means what Jesus says has authority too. So what is it that Jesus said that has authority? That contributes quite a bit of evidence to our case. And so that's where we are. Bell's going to ring in a minute, but that's where we are. And we'll be looking at the things that Jesus said, because those things now have divine authority because He's been raised from the dead by His supernatural Father. And we'll go ahead and start. But how do we take that? So what do we do with that? Okay, so Jesus has been raised from the dead. What do we do with that in our cumulative case and in our progression? We take what we've learned through all of these and we can apply them. And I think we could say this. To trust in the resurrection of Jesus is to trust not only Jesus Himself, but also the text that He trusted. And the writings of the witnesses that He commissioned to tell the world about Him. So Jesus alludes to or quotes the Old Testament 180 times in the Gospel. In the New Testament. 180 quotations. If Jesus has been raised from the dead, and He has divine authority, and everything He says that is authoritative now, and He quotes the Old Testament 180 times, then that's quite interesting. Jesus quotes from the law. He quotes almost the entire Pentateuch, or the Torah. Everything except Leviticus. He quotes from Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. From the prophets, He quotes out of Jonah, Isaiah, Daniel, Hosea, Micah, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st Samuel, and 2nd Chronicles. These are quotes that Jesus quotes in the New Testament that come from the Old. And out of the writings, He quotes the Psalms, and He quotes the Psalms extensively throughout. And that's very interesting. Jesus says in Luke 11:51, He says, so that the blood of all the prophets shed from the foundation of the world may be charged against this generation, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who perished between the altar and the sanctuary. All the prophets. He's talking to the Pharisees and their ways, and he says, this is all going to be blamed on you. All of this that you have done, all you Pharisaical non-believers. He says, so that the blood of all the prophets, all those that have come before that you've killed, the blood of Abel, all the way through to the blood of Zechariah. So if we read of, afraid Ed's fixing to ring our bell, the blood of Abel occurs in Genesis 4:8. That's the very first book of the Bible, Genesis 4:8. There it is. The blood of Abel. And the blood of Zechariah occurs in 2 Chronicles 24:20 through 22. We'll pick up there next week and go from there. But this gets interesting and this gets fun from here. So we've got 2 more classes. Hopefully there'll be time for a little bit of discussion after the second one. And then the third week, 3 weeks from now, we're going to do one quick review, do our final survey, and then we're having a catered meal across the way. So that'll be on the 20th. And then on the 21st, I'm going to sit down and shut up for a while. So if you can bear with it 3 more weeks, then we'll be done. So I appreciate your attendance and your kind way you've listened is what Virgil Trout used to always say.